Imagine a wedding day, the most joyous occasion a family can celebrate. A long table stretched under silken banners, musicians playing cheerful tunes, nobles and villagers gathered to toast the union of bride and groom. The aroma of roasted meats, spiced stews, and fresh bread drifted through the courtyard. Goblets shimmered with wine, golden and rich, as servants hurried to ensure every guest's hand was filled. Every plate was heavy. Smiles, laughter, the clinking of cups, a scene carved from pure happiness. But beneath this picture of bliss, in the heat of the kitchen fires, another story was being written. One that had nothing to do with love, but everything to do with vengeance. Because the hands that stirred the pots, the hands that seasoned the dishes, were not celebrating. They were trembling, not from fear, but from anticipation. For this feast, though dressed in celebration, carried a secret ingredient more powerful than saffron or cinnamon, a bitterness that no tongue could resist and no body could withstand. This was the taste of revenge, simmering unseen, ready to turn joy into ruin. The cook was not a guest, not a friend, not even a respected servant. They were a slave, a body owned, a voice silenced, a life reduced to labor. For years, they bent under orders, endured insults, and swallowed humiliation as easily as the scraps left after the masters had eaten their fill. They were invisible yet indispensable, the unseen architect of every banquet, the provider of sustenance to those who mocked their very existence. But on this day, the day of the great wedding, something inside them had shifted. Each insult carved into memory, each blow endured, each cruel laugh echoed until it formed a reservoir of rage too deep to contain. And into that rage the cook had poured a plan. The family trusted the cook's hands with every dish. They never wondered if the bread might hide something more than grain, or if the wine might carry more than sweetness. Their arrogance had made them blind. Their cruelty had made them vulnerable. And so, as the guests cheered and the bride smiled, the cook's secret weapon, a poison brewed in secrecy, was already coursing through the feast, waiting to bloom. First, no one noticed. The laughter drowned out the faint unease in a guest's throat, the sudden pallor on a cousin's face, the bride's slight shiver as she tried to keep smiling. But soon the music faltered. A goblet clattered to the floor, spilling red wine that looked too much like blood. Another guest gasped, clutching their stomach, while the father of the bride staggered, sweat pouring from his brow. The hall shifted from cheer to chaos in an instant. Screams replaced songs. Healers were called. Water was brought. Prayers were whispered. Yet nothing slowed the storm racing through their veins. One by one, family members and guests collapsed. Their celebration transformed into a mass grave in the making. Panic spread like wildfire, but the cook remained unseen, hidden in the shadows, watching the powerful fall powerless. Years of pain, years of silence, had ripened into this single, catastrophic hour. When the dust settled, the wedding feast was no more. It was a funeral pyre of ambition, wealth, and pride. The family that once dined with arrogance lay in ruins, undone not by rival armies, not by political plots, but by the very person they had dismissed as nothing. The cook, nameless in the eyes of their masters, had carved their name into legend with a dish that no one would ever forget. Whispers spread beyond the town, beyond the land, retelling the tale of the poisoned wedding. Some called it monstrous, others poetic, but all agreed on one truth: vengeance, once tasted, is unforgettable. And so this story survived, a chilling reminder that even the lowest, the most broken, can strike the deadliest blow when pushed too far. On that day, the cook served not food, but justice, and it was devoured whole. To understand the poison that would soon flow through their veins, one must first understand the world in which the cook lived. In this household, food was more than sustenance. It was a weapon of prestige. Every banquet was staged not merely to feed but to display power, to show guests that the family's wealth could command spices from distant lands, wines from across seas, and meats fattened to perfection. Yet for the enslaved, every lavish feast was a reminder of distance, a chasm between those who ate with excess and those who cooked on scraps. The cook, trained in the delicate balance of flavor and aroma, was indispensable and yet entirely disposable. They were praised when dishes pleased the tongue and beaten when the masters were displeased, regardless of fault. On this wedding day, the pressure doubled. Nothing could be permitted to falter. Every servant, every slave, knew that mistakes on such an occasion could mean punishment that lingered for days. But for the cook, this was not merely another banquet. The endless rehearsals of cruelty they had endured had hardened into resolve. While the household celebrated the joining of two families, the cook saw something else entirely: an opportunity. The family itself bore a reputation that reached beyond their lands. They were known for their splendor, but equally for their cruelty. The patriarch, a man who wore gold rings on every finger, carried pride like armor, and regarded his slaves as tools no different from the pots and pans in his kitchen. His wife, draped in jewels, was whispered to be merciless in her punishments, her temper as sharp as the needles in her embroidery. The children, heirs to power, mirrored their parents' arrogance, mocking those who served them, turning lives into entertainment. For the guests who would gather, this wedding was to be a spectacle of alliances, a promise that the family's grip on wealth and prestige would continue unbroken. But for those in chains, it was another day of servitude stretched thin until skin cracked and bones ached. The cook, in particular, bore years of memories. Memories of hunger when the family wasted food, of lashes when dishes cooled too quickly, of humiliation served daily alongside meals. Yet, in the cruel irony of fate, this very proximity to power gave the cook the opening that no enemy could find. For who else had their hands on every plate? Who else could touch what the masters consumed without suspicion? And so, as dawn broke on the wedding day, the estate stirred with restless energy. Trumpets announced the arrival of guests, the air filled with laughter and excitement, and the kitchens roared to life with fires lit before the sun itself had risen. The cook moved among the chaos, directing lesser hands, tasting sauces, adjusting spices, and ensuring perfection in every dish. To all who looked, they were nothing more than a servant doing their duty, a figure without name, swallowed in the machinery of wealth. But beneath the surface of routine, every motion carried intent. The choice of dishes, the placement of goblets, the stirring of pots, each step was a rehearsal in revenge. No one wondered if the cook might despise them. No one imagined that loyalty was absent, or that rage had been building quietly for years. In their arrogance, the family believed themselves untouchable. Yet at that very moment, they were more vulnerable than ever. For when one controls the food, one controls life itself. And as the scent of roasted meats filled the air and guests began to arrive in silks and jewels, the cook's plan moved closer to reality. The table was set, the stage prepared, and the first act of tragedy was moments away. Before the poison was ever brewed, before the wedding day turned into a graveyard of celebration, there was a life lived in silence. The cook had not always been in chains. Once, perhaps, they had a family of their own, a name spoken with tenderness, a past that was erased when the weight of slavery fell upon them. In the master's estate, identity dissolved into function. They were no longer a person but a role. The one who cooked, the one who sweated in the firelit kitchen, the one who kept hunger from the table of their oppressors. For years, their existence was bound to the rhythm of demands: faster, Hotter, better. They were shouted at more than spoken to, seen more as an extension of the kitchen than a human soul. When the dishes pleased, no credit was given. When a noble guest frowned, punishment came swiftly. A whip across the back, a night without food, or the humiliation of being forced to eat the scraps thrown to dogs. The cook learned quickly that silence was survival. But even silence has limits. Each insult, each strike, each night of hunger carved into their memory like scars no one else could see. A life of endurance was becoming a life of resistance, though no one yet knew it. The cook's daily world was fire and hunger. From dawn until long past dusk, they labored in a kitchen that felt more like a furnace than a room. Sweat dripped endlessly as fires roared, and their hands, once soft perhaps, were now calloused, scarred, and burned from years of work. Every dish they crafted was a paradox. Beautiful, delicate, full of flavor, yet made for mouths that cursed their very existence. They were forced to prepare feasts they would never taste, golden dishes they could not touch, wine sweeter than freedom poured for masters who treated them worse than cattle. And while the family stuffed themselves to excess, the cook often survived on scraps of burnt bread or a ladle of thin broth. This imbalance, repeated day after day, gnawed at the soul. To the outside world, it seemed invisible, one more slave in one more household. But to the cook, it was an unending torment, to create joy for those who inflicted only misery. And yet, in their suffering, they became skilled. Their knowledge of herbs, of roots, of hidden flavors grew sharper. While the family mocked, they were unknowingly shaping the very tool of their undoing. The cruelty of the masters was not limited to words. Beatings were common, often over trivial mistakes. A dish too cold, a spice too strong, a guest who frowned. All became excuses for violence. Once, when a sauce was delayed, the patriarch himself struck the cook across the face, the ring on his finger leaving a cut that scarred for life. Another time, the mistress, enraged at a misplaced platter, ordered the cook to kneel in the dirt while guests laughed. These moments were not isolated. They were the rhythm of existence in the household. The children, growing up in privilege, mirrored their parents' disdain. They found amusement in cruelty, tossing food to the ground to watch slaves scramble, or inventing punishments as if it were a game. To the cook, every humiliation was another stone placed upon their chest, another weight pressing down. But buried beneath that weight was something hardening. Anger, silent, patient anger. For years it smoldered, unspoken but alive, waiting for the right spark. And when whispers of a wedding reached the kitchen, and preparations began for the grandest feast the estate had ever seen, the cook felt that spark. On the surface, the cook remained obedient, their head bowed, their voice soft, their steps measured. They appeared to bend under the weight of servitude, but within, something had shifted. The suffering that once broke them was now forging them. Every insult became fuel, every blow another reason. They began to see the wedding not as a celebration but as a stage, the perfect theater for retribution. For on this day the family would be vulnerable. They would open their mouths wide to feast, never questioning the hands that fed them. They would laugh, drink, and trust blindly in the cook's work. And in that trust the cook saw destiny. It was not madness, but clarity. Their life had been stolen, their dignity stripped, their humanity denied. But here was a chance to reclaim it, not by words, not by rebellion doomed to fail, but by a weapon only they could wield: the food. Every meal had once been a reminder of their servitude. Now, the cook resolved, it would become the family's undoing. Suffering had given birth to resolve. Resolve would soon become action. And action, as the family would learn, would taste like death. The wedding preparations stretched across weeks, and within that span, The cook watched, planned, and waited. Every order from the masters, every delivery of food, every barrel of wine became a piece of the puzzle. Their rage, long simmering in silence, began to sharpen into strategy. The cook knew that an open act of defiance would mean swift death. A slave who raised a hand in violence would be crushed before they could breathe. But food was different. Food slipped past suspicion, entering mouths without thought. In a household drunk on its own arrogance, no one doubted the hands that had always fed them. That was their weakness, and the cook would exploit it. Yet vengeance required more than anger. It required patience, cunning, and precision. The cook turned their knowledge of herbs and roots, of powders both healing and harmful, into their weapon. They began to collect, in secret, small amounts of bitter plants hidden in corners of the market, seeds that when boiled released toxins, and mushrooms that grew in damp places, deadly if prepared the right way. Smuggled into the kitchen among sacks of grain and bundles of greens, these poisons waited quietly, as patient as their wielder. For each day that passed, the cook rehearsed the moment in their mind. The clinking goblets, the laughter, and then silence. The cook knew that too much poison would arouse suspicion. The dish would taste strange, the death too obvious. The trick was subtlety, a balance learned only by someone who had spent years measuring flavors so carefully. In the smoky shadows of the kitchen, they experimented in silence. A pinch too much, and the bitterness could not be masked. Too little, and the victims might only sicken instead of fall. So the cook mixed and tested, slipping tiny amounts into portions of food discarded by other slaves, watching the effect on rats that scurried through the refuse. Slowly, the formula emerged. A blend strong enough to kill, yet slow enough to appear as sudden illness. To disguise the taste, the cook planned to hide it in dishes rich with spices and wine, meals so heavily seasoned that even the sharpest tongue would not detect the hidden note of bitterness. They decided upon 3 targets: the father, the mother, and the groom. For without them, the family structure would collapse into ruin. Yet once the decision was made, the cook realized something else. Greed would do the rest. The poison would spread not only to the intended but to anyone at the table who reached too eagerly for seconds. The cook's hand trembled not with fear but with anticipation. This was no longer simply survival. This was justice measured in spoons and ladles. As the wedding day drew closer, the estate swelled with noise and motion. Carts of food arrived daily: lambs, poultry, fresh vegetables, barrels of spiced wine, wheels of cheese. The kitchens roared with fire and sweat as assistants chopped, stirred, and prepared under the cook's stern command. No one questioned their authority in the kitchen, for even the masters understood that such a feast required skill beyond their grasp. This was the cook's domain, their kingdom of smoke and flame, and within it, they alone ruled. Hidden among the ordinary ingredients were the instruments of death: a pouch of powdered root buried within a sack of flour, a vial of dark liquid concealed beneath jars of honey. The cook worked like an artist, blending poison as carefully as a painter mixes colors. And each time they looked upon the wedding hall being decorated, each time they saw the family strut in pride and arrogance, their resolve deepened. They imagined the father's ringed hand trembling, the mother's jeweled face twisted in agony, the groom collapsing mid-toast. They pictured the guests screaming, the chaos, the downfall. It was not madness but vision, a performance, with the wedding as stage and the poisoned feast as masterpiece. What others saw as celebration, the cook saw as destiny written in fire and venom. Finally, the day arrived. At dawn, the cook stood before the blazing hearth, sleeves rolled, eyes steady. Assistants bustled with trays and knives, but only the cook knew what was hidden within the recipes. Into the roasted meats, Into the spiced stews, into the goblets of wine went the invisible touch of death. The poisons dissolved, their bitterness masked beneath garlic and saffron, cinnamon and clove. No guest would suspect, no master would pause before taking the first bite. The dishes left the kitchen one by one, carried into the hall where laughter and music rose like a tide. The cook remained behind, wiping sweat from their brow, heart pounding not with fear but with a strange calm. Years of suffering had led to this single day, this single meal. As they watched servants carry platters into the hall, they knew that fate itself had been seasoned, plated, and served. In a few hours, the power of the masters would crumble, not by sword or rebellion, but by spoon and cup. The cook, once voiceless, had found a way to speak, and their voice would echo in the silence that followed the family's last feast. The wedding hall gleamed like a palace. Long tables were lined with silver platters, polished goblets, and embroidered cloth. Musicians filled the air with melodies, their flutes and drums rising above the chatter of nobles and merchants who had come to witness the union. The bride, radiant in silk, smiled with practiced grace, while the groom stood tall, his pride nearly visible as a crown upon his head. Laughter echoed, wine spilled freely, and servants rushed to refill cups and carry steaming dishes to the guests. To an outsider, it was a picture of harmony and splendor. But beneath the surface, destiny was coiling. Each dish that arrived carried more than flavor. It carried the invisible venom that the cook had so carefully brewed. The family sat at the head of the table, proud, unaware, their arrogance shielding them from suspicion. They raised their cups, toasted the future, and welcomed the feast with open mouths and eager hands. The cook remained in the shadows of the kitchen doorway, watching as the first bites were taken, as the first gulps of wine disappeared. Their face revealed nothing, but their heart counted each swallow like the ticking of a clock. The hour had begun. At first, nothing disturbed the celebration. Music swelled, laughter grew louder, and the guests praised the richness of the food. The father boasted about the spices, the mother complimented the flavors, and the groom raised his goblet high in pride. But then a shift, so small, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. A cousin paled, clutching their stomach, whispering of dizziness. Another guest coughed violently, their goblets slipping from trembling fingers, the wine spilling red across the white cloth like blood. Nervous laughter followed, brushed aside as overindulgence. But soon more faltered. The bride's smile trembled, her lips quivering as she pressed a hand to her chest. The groom staggered, confused, his laughter cracking into coughs. The patriarch's golden-ringed fingers trembled around his cup, his face growing pale. A silence began to creep through the hall, broken only by the clatter of plates and the sharp gasps of those suddenly aware that something was terribly wrong. Guests rose in panic, calling for healers, demanding water, praying aloud. But the poison was already dancing in their veins, unstoppable, merciless. The celebration began to unravel, thread by thread. Chaos erupted. The music faltered, instruments dropping to the floor as musicians fled. Servants screamed, unsure whether to help or run. Nobles stumbled from their seats, clutching their bellies, vomiting into their goblets, collapsing upon the very tables that once glittered with pride. The patriarch slammed his fist onto the table, his voice hoarse, demanding answers even as sweat streamed down his brow. The mother wailed, her jeweled hair undone, her face twisted in pain. The groom, once the picture of confidence, fell to his knees before his bride, his strength dissolving as he gasped for breath. Some tried to flee the hall, but the poison worked swiftly, weakening their legs until they stumbled and fell in the dirt outside. Panic spread like fire, but no remedy, No prayer, no frantic attempt to purge the poison could undo what had been done. The family, so powerful, so untouchable in their wealth and arrogance, was brought low in minutes by the hands of the one they thought beneath them. The hall that had echoed with music and joy now trembled with screams and the heavy silence of death creeping closer. And there, in the shadows of the kitchen, the cook stood still. They did not smile, did not laugh, did not gloat. Their eyes remained steady as they watched the family collapse into ruin. The noise of panic filled the hall, wails, crashes, prayers. But in the cook's mind, all was quiet. Years of suffering, humiliation, and silent rage had narrowed into this single moment. The masters who had feasted on cruelty now choked on their own power. One by one, the family members slumped, their legacy ending not with triumph but with poison. The bride's veil fell into her lap as she gasped her last breath. The groom's hand clawed at the table before going still. The patriarch toppled from his chair, rings clinking uselessly on stone. Guests fled in terror, but the tale would spread faster than their feet. The story of a wedding feast that turned into a grave. And as the last cries faded, the cook stepped back into the heat of the kitchen, where the fire still burned and pots still boiled, as if nothing had happened. They had spoken at last, not with words, but with a feast that would echo through history as both curse and legend. The wedding hall, once filled with music and perfume, was now a chamber of ruin. Bodies lay sprawled across tables, once proud nobles reduced to lifeless husks among spilled wine and overturned plates. The smell of roasted meat still lingered in the air, but it mixed now with the acrid stench of sickness and death. Servants wept in corners, terrified not only of the horror they had witnessed, but of what it meant for their futures. Guests who had survived fled into the night, their footsteps echoing against the stone, carrying with them whispers that would soon spread like wildfire. A family destroyed at their own feast. The once mighty household, known for its wealth and cruelty, had collapsed in a single day, undone not by rival armies or political betrayal, but by the quiet hand of a slave they had ignored. And what of the cook? Some whispered that they fled into the shadows before the chaos fully erupted, vanishing into the world, never to be seen again. Others claimed they were captured, dragged into the courtyard, and executed on the spot, their body left as a warning. Yet the truth, like the flavor of poison hidden in rich spices, was harder to taste. Legends soon multiplied. In one version, the cook slipped away into the wilderness, free for the first time, their name erased but their act immortal. In another, they were taken by local authorities, tortured for confessions, and burned alive so that the ashes of their defiance might scatter in the wind. Some tales even suggest that the cook stood boldly before their captors, unflinching, declaring their vengeance fulfilled before death embraced them. Whatever the truth, the story spread beyond the estate, beyond the town, beyond the land itself. Traders carried the tale across borders, bards sang it in taverns, peasants whispered it at firesides. It became more than history, it became myth. For common folk, it was a story of justice, proof that even the most powerless could strike down the mighty when cruelty left no other path. For the powerful, it was a cautionary whisper, a reminder to watch their kitchens, to fear the invisible hand that prepared their meals. And for slaves, it was a spark of hope, a tale of resistance told in secret, a reminder that vengeance, though rare, was not impossible. The family's legacy withered overnight. Lands once proud with banners stood quiet, their wealth divided among distant relatives who feared inheriting the curse of the poisoned feast. Their name, once spoken with awe, became a warning, a symbol of arrogance punished. Future generations remembered them not for their riches or their alliances but for the night of their downfall. The wedding that should have bound families together instead severed their line forever. And yet, in strange irony, the cook who had been nameless in life became unforgettable in legend. Though their true name was lost, people gave them titles. The poisoner's hand, the silent cook, the wedding shadow. Their act was retold not only as revenge but as poetry, a macabre justice served on silver platters. Even centuries later, storytellers leaned close to their listeners, lowering their voices to recount how an entire house was toppled by a slave's hand, by a dish laced with bitterness deeper than any herb. What began as a tragedy grew into a parable, a moral dagger aimed at the hearts of the arrogant. And so the tale endured. Was it history? Was it legend? Perhaps both. But in every retelling, one truth remained. The powerful were not untouchable, and the voiceless were not powerless. The cook who had been dismissed as nothing left behind a story that echoed louder than armies, more lasting than monuments. The poisoned wedding became a cautionary tale told wherever people gathered to eat, a reminder that trust, once abused, could become the deadliest vulnerability. In the end, it mattered little whether the cook escaped or perished. What mattered was that for a single, unforgettable night, justice had been served in the only form left available to them. Sweet, bitter, and final. A feast of death that ensured the family's cruelty would never pass unpunished. And long after the estate crumbled and the banners rotted, the story remained alive in the mouths of those who told it. A warning, a lesson, and a whisper of vengeance carried on the wind. History is often written by the victors, carved in stone by those who hold power. But some stories slip through the cracks, whispered not in palaces but in kitchens, not on battlefields but at tables where no one expected rebellion. The poisoned wedding is one such story, an echo of resistance born in silence. What makes it unforgettable is not simply the act of killing, but the contrast it embodies. A day meant for joy turned into despair, a feast transformed into a grave. Weddings are supposed to be about union, about beginning new lives. Yet for this family, it became an ending so absolute that their name was remembered only through the shadow of their death. And it was not an army, not a rival noble, not a scheming ally who brought them down. It was the one they deemed invisible, the one who carried scars hidden beneath sleeves and silence. The cook did not carry a sword, nor wear armor, yet their weapon proved sharper than steel. That is why this tale lingers, because it asks us to look again at the unseen hands that feed us, and at the arrogance that blinds the powerful to their own fragility. Consider the bitter poetry of it. The family spent their lives humiliating those beneath them, dismissing the very hands that kept them alive. They saw food as abundance, as a stage to flaunt wealth, never realizing that every bite was a pact of trust. The cook, forced into servitude, had no power in words, no place in society, no chance at justice in courts built for masters. But through patience and precision, they found a weapon that none could guard against. It is here the story takes on a universal weight. Power can crumble from within, arrogance can invite destruction, and vengeance can hide in the smallest places. It is not the grand armies that always decide fate, but sometimes the quiet figures no one bothers to notice. In that sense, the poisoned wedding is not just a tale of revenge. It is a mirror, held up to every age, warning that cruelty breeds consequences. The cook did not destroy the family out of madness, but out of memory of every lash, every insult, every night of hunger. What they served was not only poison, but years of accumulated suffering, distilled into one final act. And yet, the story also unsettles us. Was the act justice, or was it monstrosity? Did the cook achieve liberation, or only spread more pain? The answers shift with the teller, with the listener, with the age in which it is spoken. To some, the cook is a hero, a symbol of defiance, a warning to tyrants that even slaves can rise. To others, they are a ghost, a murderer whose vengeance stained the innocent alongside the guilty. That tension is what keeps the story alive, because it does not allow easy answers. It forces us to look at the blurred line between justice and vengeance, between righteousness and cruelty. Perhaps that is why centuries later, people still lean close to hear the tale, to feel the chill of imagining a feast where laughter dies and pride collapses. It asks us, how much cruelty must one endure before vengeance is not only understandable, but inevitable? And when vengeance comes, does it cleanse, or does it merely continue the cycle of suffering? These are questions the poisoned wedding forces us to face, and they are questions with no simple end. So the story lingers, not as a mere curiosity, but as a haunting reminder. Power is fragile, cruelty is remembered, and silence does not always mean submission. The cook, nameless yet immortal in legend, left behind no monuments, no heirs, no possessions. And yet, they left behind something far greater, a warning, a story that traveled across lands, carried in whispers and songs, shaping the fears of the powerful and the hopes of the powerless. On that wedding day, vengeance was served as the final course, and its taste has never faded from memory. The poisoned feast became more than tragedy. It became prophecy, that those who build their thrones on cruelty may one day find themselves toppled not by armies, but by the very hands they believed too small to matter. And so the tale closes as it began, with a feast. But this feast did not nourish. It destroyed. It did not unite. It ended. It did not celebrate life. It crowned death. And through it, the cook's silence finally spoke louder than any master's voice, echoing through time. Beware the hands you despise, for they may one day decide your final meal.